to Seattle Atheist Church. Atheists, agnostics, skeptics, whatever you like to call yourself, you are welcome here. At Seattle Atheist Church, we call ourselves an atheist church because you will never hear anything supernatural promoted from the podium. Our church was founded on the principles of scientific naturalism and secular ethics. Truth claims are attempted here, and we stand ready to revise our thinking in light of new information. We attempt to be excellent to all conscious beings, and we believe in good because good works in non-mysterious ways. If that sounds about right to you, then you are probably in the right place. So I would like to, we have a couple of announcements. So on the 12th, we're going to have our movie night. And the movie movie is going to be Hidden Figures. So I will put that up on the site, on the meetup group. Please sign up for it so you can get sent the information about how to get there. Okay. Then on the 13th, at 3 o'clock, we're going to have board games. And that will be at the, it's called Wayward Coffee House. And notice that there's some other place with a very similar name. I'm not going to say the other name and get you confused, but make sure that it's Wayward Coffee House. There's an actual address is there on the website as well. So you are welcome to come to both of those things. Please invite a friend. And afterwards, we're going to sit in a big circle and we'll have conversation, okay? So also, if you would like to contribute financially, we do have the jar back there. And if you want to do it by going online, you could do it online as well. So our members give the talks. We give the talks. And probably the most important part happens after the talk when we have our discussion. And so today we have Stephen giving a talk on free will without any further ado. No.
All right. Hey, thank you everyone for coming today. So I'm going to start. How many of you have seen the show Westworld? Just out of curiosity. It's a great show. It's a lot of fun. Really, Jack? No Westworld? Yeah, come on, it's a great show.
Not my list.
Okay, so I won't spoil it, but there's a really great scene in Westworld where you all know the general setup of Westworld. They're all robots, right? They're all robots. It's a Western town. One of the characters' name is Maeve, and she owns a brothel in Westworld. And there's a great scene in the series where the technicians wake her up, and they explain to her that you're actually not human. You're actually a robot. And she says, well, no, there's absolutely no way I'm a robot. I get to choose what I do. What are you talking about? And then they pair her up with an iPad. Looks like an iPad. And then every time she speaks, right before she speaks, it says exactly what she's going to say on the iPad. And of course, since this is a science fiction show, they have to, does not compute. She gets confused. She freezes. She does the old Star Trek thing of, smoke coming out, and goes into freeze mode. The reason I'm bringing up that example is this is exactly what this talk is about. This talk is about discovering whether or not there's some shocking truth to be discovered here about free will, whether we'll wake up someday and discover we're robots just like Maeve, that everything that we do is pre-programmed, we're just following this script, we could be paired up with this machine and could, predict exactly what we'll do at any moment. So I'm going to focus mainly on Sam Harris's book, Free Will, and also talk a little bit about Daniel Dennett's book, Freedom Evolves. Those are the two main sources of material. I'll be pulling all the material from this talk from. In Sam Harris's book, Free Will, he actually argues that there is no such thing as free will. He's a hard determinist. He believes that we are just like Maeve the robot, and that this is a shocking truth that has some pretty substantial implications for our legal system and for our moral system. He has a very basic argument. He says that our popular conception of free will rests on two assumptions. And the two assumptions are that we are the conscious source of most of our thoughts and actions in the present. So we are the authors of of what we do, and consciously the author of what we do. And second of all, that each of us could have behaved differently than we did in the past. So those are the two assumptions that he thinks are necessary for the ordinary language sense of free will. And in the book, he's going to show that both of those assumptions are wrong. So let's start with the first assumption. First assumption is that we are the conscious source of our thoughts and actions. And at this point, there's actually pretty substantial evidence from science that we are a lot like Maeve. There's been some experiments done. The most famous one was, I'm not sure how to pronounce his name. I think it's Benjamin Libet. Could be Libet, I don't know. I've only read his name. But he did EEG experiments to show that you can predict whether or not a person would move 300 milliseconds before the person actually moves. So that's pretty Maeve-like, right? Looking at the iPad, being able to predict whether someone's moving or not. And then more recently, using fMRI, they were able to extend that experiment to be able to predict people's actions 7 to 10 seconds, not milliseconds, 7 to 10 seconds before a person acts. That's pretty extreme. That makes us feel like late to the show, right? On deciding what you're going to do. So these are pretty dramatic experiments. We're not at the point yet where we can use an iPad and predict people's actions, but theoretically, it doesn't seem like it's impossible. It seems like we have some pretty good evidence that we could get to a point like that once we had good enough brain scanning stuff and whatever. So Sam Harris writes, one fact now appears to be indisputable. Some moments before you are aware of what you will do next, a time in which you subjectively appear to have complete freedom to behave as you please, your brain has already determined what you will do. You then become, quote, conscious of this, quote, decision and believe that you are in the process of making it. So, look, for me, I completely accept this. This is not, at this point it is shocking, but we have a lot of evidence to show it. I did a sermon a couple months ago on Strangers to Ourselves, the book about the unconscious. The conscious self is just the tip of the iceberg, right? There's abundant evidence to say that a lot of the interesting things happen behind the scenes. I'll give you a quick test. Everyone right now, think of a number between 1 and 10. Everyone thought of a number between 1 and 10? All right, fantastic. So Tyrell, how did you think of that number?
7.
You thought of 7? So how did you come up with that number?
That was my number.
That's cheating. I think 7 is a lucky number.
We're going 10 off.
Everyone did 7? But that's scary.
You were supposed to do the other way and convince us that you can read minds or something.
So everyone thought it was 7. Okay.
Do a mentalist thing.
Okay, I'll try to do that. But the point is that we have all these thoughts that appear in the theater of our consciousness, and we have no idea where these thoughts come from. If you think of yourself, think of a random number. You'll think of a random number, but you have no insight into the process that gave you that random number. It just appears. And that's what Sam Harris is arguing that all of our thoughts are like. There's some, complicated processing going on in the background that we have no access to at all, and these things just appear in our head. So that's pretty good evidence that we work like Maeve. We're pre-programmed in some way. Okay. So second assumption, we could have behaved differently. So Sam Harris writes, to say that I could have done otherwise is merely to think the thought, quote, I could have done otherwise, after doing whatever I did in fact do. And he says this is an empty affirmation. So he says it's meaningless to talk about being able to do otherwise if you have all the causal antecedents to whatever you did. Okay, so what does Sam Harris conclude that this means for ethics? Well, he writes that the belief in free will has given us both the religious conception of sin and our commitment to retributive justice. The U.S. Supreme Court has called free will a, quote, universal and persistent, end quote, foundation for a system of law distinct from a deterministic view of human conduct that is inconsistent with the underlying precepts of our criminal justice system. So, oh my, we're in trouble because if there's no free will, then our whole justice system is in danger. Our whole religious way of thinking about the world is in danger. Pull the fire alarms, go around screaming. Okay, so the fact that there is no free will should have a radical effect on law. Sam Harris writes, speaking from personal experience, I think that losing the sense of free will has only improved my ethics by increasing my feelings of compassion and forgiveness and diminishing my sense of entitlement to the fruits of my good luck. So understanding the shocking truth that there is no free will has made him a better person, because instead of him feeling more personally that, he did it, he understands that a lot of stuff in life is just through luck. Okay, so I'm going to consider a concrete real-world example having to do with free will. I'm going to pull this from Sam Harris's book. Now, I should warn you, if anyone has children under the age of 11, I actually recommend that this isn't the best thing for them to hear, so maybe they want to leave the room. I've actually watered down the example significantly so that it's not going to be an issue. But if you are concerned, if you have younger children, I would recommend that we just take a moment to water it down. And then I'll say when the example's over. Sorry. Thank you. All right, here we go. Do not be overly shocked. Well, actually, I shouldn't say that. This is a horrible story. And that's why I asked the children to leave the room. Yeah, Nate, I'm sorry. I want to leave. In the early morning of July 23rd, 2007, Stephen Hayes and Joshua Komorowski, two career criminals, arrived at the home of Dr. William and Jennifer Petit in Cheshire, a quiet town in central Connecticut. They found Dr. Petit asleep on a sofa in the sunroom. Komorowski struck Dr. William with all of his strength with a baseball bat. They bound his hands and went upstairs, where they found Jennifer Petit and their two daughters. They tied them up to the bed. One of the criminals, Stephen Hayes, took the mother to a bank to withdraw $15,000 in cash. And when they returned to the house, they noticed that Dr. William Petit had escaped. Panicking, they doused the house in gasoline and lit the house on fire. When asked by the police why he hadn't untied the girls from the bed before setting the house on fire, Komorowski said, quote, "It just didn't cross my mind." The girls died of smoke inhalation. Dr. William Petit was the only survivor of the attack. So this is a true story. It's a horrible story, right? And this isn't, even the whole story. It's awful what these two criminals did. And this is the reason it's important to look at a real world example in this is, this isn't just the question of free will just isn't an abstract discussion. It determines how you think about, moral situations like this. So I wanted a scenario that was extreme enough so you know what the stakes are. This is what Sam Harris says about this situation. In answer to the question, should you blame these two criminals for their horrific crime, Harris writes, "As sickening as I find their behavior, I have to admit that if I were to trade places with one of these men, atom for atom, I would be him. There is no extra part of me that could decide to see the world differently or to resist the impulse to victimize other people. Even if you believe that every human being harbors an immortal soul, the problem of responsibility remains. I cannot take credit for the fact that I do not have the soul of a psychopath. If I had truly been in Komorowski's shoes on July 3rd, 2007, that is, if I had his genes and his life experience and his identical brain or soul in an identical state, I would have acted exactly as he did. There's simply no intellectually respectable position from which to deny this. The role of luck, therefore, appears to be decisive." And this is me. Therefore, the right answer is, there but for the grace of luck go I. That's the basic attitude, right? All right. So I'm going to call this the shocking conclusion. And any children who want to come back into the room, it's good to, that's it for scary stories. Thank you. Okay, so I call this the shocking conclusion. So are we forced to accept this shocking conclusion? Are we forced to accept it? So broadly speaking, in the vast literature on free will, and remember there's over 2,000 years of writing on this stuff now, so there's a lot of literature on free will. In the vast literature of free will, broadly speaking, there are three main approaches to the problem of free will. There's something called libertarianism, and that's people who believe that they can act counter to causation, contra-causal free will. And there's really not many of those people around, so I'm not going to waste time on it, because these are people who believe that, except maybe religious people, but there are people who believe that regardless of everything that happens around them, they can act independently of all causation. The reason this is such a hard position to defend is you would expect those people to quickly go walking off of cliffs or do other things. If they're really not influenced by their environment around them, if they're not influenced by their brain, it's hard to see how they can actually navigate the world as it actually exists. So it's a really hard position to defend, and it's mainly religious folk who try to defend it. So I'm not going to spend any time on that at all. The second position is determinism, and that's what Sam Harris is. He's a determinist. He's a hard determinist. And determinists believe that science has uncovered a shocking truth, that our belief that we are free, that we have free choice, is an illusion, and that has profound implications for how we should lead our lives. And then finally, the third position, compatibilism, is a position of David Hume. And it's also, by the way, the position of Daniel Dennett. So there are a lot of respectable compatibilists. Modern philosophers are compatibilists. Compatibilists believe that determinists have it all wrong. That as usual, they've heard people talking and they've misconstrued their words, and there's a sense of free will that is completely compatible with determinism. And so there's not a shocking truth to be overcome here, because it's just they've misunderstood what people are talking about in ordinary language when they're talking about free will. And that's the position that I'm going to defend today, compatibilism. I don't think we have to accept Sam Harris's shocking conclusion, because I think there's a very simple explanation for our ordinary speech around free will, and to deal with situations like this horrific crime where you don't have to say, well, but for the grace of luck, go I. So let me focus on compatibilism. So compatibilism, compatibilists believe, again, that determinists like Sam Harris are simply misunderstanding ordinary human language. They are misunderstanding how the phrase free will or free choice is used in ordinary language. And I just flew back from Austin yesterday. I was on the plane, so I was reading through the New York Times, and I was actually surprised to see phrases like free choice appear in the New York Times articles. It is something that's commonly used, but the way that the phrase free choice or free will is normally used in a legal context or in a newspaper context is talking about whether or not someone was coerced to do the thing that they did, whether it flowed from their natural personality or not, or whether they were forced to do it outside of their control. And that's the ordinary language sense of free will. And I don't want to gloss over, one of the reasons there's such a huge literature about free will is actually figuring that division line out between what's free and what's not. The legal system uses it, but it turns out to be very, very hard, right? There's a lot of gray areas and a lot of edge cases. But that's, I would still contend, is what we mean by free will. We mean whether or not we were coerced to do something. So let me give you some examples. And so imagine you're walking into a room, there's a table, there's a piece of cake. The piece of cake is actually for someone else, right? So you see that piece of cake there. I'm stealing this from Jack's sermon. So there's a piece of cake there. So you go in and you eat the cake. All things being equal, in that case, I would say you did that of your own free will. You saw a piece of cake and you ate it, right? Now, imagine the same scenario. This time you walk into the room, but someone holds a gun to your head and says, eat that piece of cake. In that case, you didn't have any choice, right? You had to eat the piece of cake because someone held a gun to your head. And so in that case, you were coerced and you ate the piece of cake. Now, things get more complicated if you bring in, let's say that someone did a study and they discovered that 99% of people who enter a room and discover a piece of cake, they're just bound to eat that piece of cake. We've just established through this scientific study that 99% of people can't help themselves. And in that case, we would say, well, okay, now it's a gray area. Because, while it's true they weren't really coerced, if everyone is forced to do it, if a normal person would eat that piece of cake, and it's hard to blame that person because everyone would do it in that situation. And then finally, let's imagine that you knew the previous fact that 99% of people would eat the piece of cake, but this time you're told that if you eat that piece of cake, an innocent person in the next room will die if you eat that piece of cake. So now you walk in, if you ate that piece of cake, I would still blame you for eating the piece of cake, even though most of the time people do eat, because the stakes are so high, right? You're going to really kill that person? I mean, it's a nice looking piece of cake, but seriously, is it worth killing that innocent guy in the next room? I don't think so. Okay, so that's the basic idea behind compatibilism. Again, there's a lot of complexity here, I understand. I'm just going to ignore all that and just say that this is really what we mean in legal context and in ordinary language when we're talking about free will. So Sam Harris, of course, is aware of compatibilism, and he has two arguments that he uses against it. I want to talk about those two arguments now. First, he writes, people have many competing desires, and some desires appear pathological, that is, undesirable, even to those in their grip. Most people are ruled by many mutually incompatible goals and aspirations. You want to finish your work, but you are inclined to stop working so you can play with your kids. You aspire to stop smoking, but you also crave another cigarette. You're struggling to save money, but you are also tempted to buy a new computer. Where is the freedom when one of these opposing desires inexplicably triumphs over its rival? All right, so absolutely. The inner head of Stephen is a mess. There's all of these conflicting desires, this chaos up there. Most humans are pretty messy psychologically. They don't have just one pure desire. They're usually in conflict and they have to make decisions. What I would say in this case is, we often don't really know ourselves until we make the decisions that we do. A person's drowning in a lake while we're walking on a path. At one moment we want to do the right thing, go leaping into the lake and save them. At the same time, we might be afraid that we'll drown. I don't want to drown. And so you have these competing desires. Which one wins out? Might be by the thinnest margins that one desire wins over the other one. And then we learn something about who we are. I discovered I was a coward today. I discovered I was a brave person today. You don't know often until those conflicts are resolved and you do whatever you want to do. So my response, I guess, in this case to Sam Harris is just to say, sure, we have psychology is messy, but that doesn't change the fact that he's trying to argue here that there's no true self, where we can decide whether it's the actions are coming from the true self. But I would just say that all the messiness that is, human psychology is our true self. His second argument is he says that a compatibilist claims that you act of your own free will when you're not coerced into acting in a certain way. So what he says is, and there is no way I can influence my desires. For what tools of influence could I use? Other desires? To say that I would have done otherwise had I wanted to is simply to say that I would have lived in a different universe had I been in a different universe. Compatibilism amounts to nothing more than an assertion of the following creed. Here we go. A puppet is free as long as he loves his strings. That's the little cover for his book, so drama. Here we go. All right, so the argument here is, again, this is going back to you could not have acted in any other way. So in what sense does it mean anything to talk about free will? Because there's no other possibilities. We actually look at, we're like Maeve, right? There's a bunch of events that happen beforehand, and then we act in the way that, those events force us to act. So I want to focus on the second argument because I think this is really his main argument, that there's no sense of free will because the criminals could not have acted otherwise. So I want to focus on that argument. So what I want to say is actually really simple. I want to say that what Sam is doing is he's collapsing the actual and the possible. He's not distinguishing the way that the actual world is apart from other possible worlds. He says that criminals could not have acted otherwise. Given everything about the history of Stephen Hayes and Joshua Komazurski, the only possibility is that they killed the people that day. So let's move this example into a less emotional context. And I'm going to throw this question out at you. Who thinks that might have rained today?
Might have.
Might have rained today.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. For those who didn't raise their hand on this one, who thinks that wall might have been, painted blue? Jack, are you holding out above them?
I'm slightly colorblind, so.
Oh, yeah. So nice. So we use counterfactuals all the time in talking about the world. So in a certain sense, if you refuse to entertain alternative possibilities, then at a certain point, what I would say is you're not actually using the English language in the way that's supposed to be used by allowing people to use counterfactuals when in discussion. So the meaning of your words are most likely different from mine. For example, we might feel relief that it didn't rain today because the rain would have ruined the picnic. So we deliberate using counterfactuals. In fact, I would say something stronger. Well, actually, before I get to that, let me address the question of what exactly are we doing when we're considering counterfactuals. One thing is, let's say that we imagined it rained yesterday. What exactly are we imagining in that case? Well, we're not getting into all the details of what it would mean for it not to rain yesterday, because really, if you believe in the laws of nature and all the physics and everything involved, you would have to spin back time and make all sorts of changes to get up to that point where it didn't rain yesterday, right? It would be a huge undertaking to unwind all of history so you could explain why it didn't rain yesterday, because, rain depends on the amount of moisture in the air, it depends on some basic, physics of the weather, all this complicated stuff. You're definitely not imagining all of that. I can guarantee you that you haven't worked out all the physics to allow it to rain yesterday, because that would require too much of the changing of the past. What I really suspect that you're doing is you're just imagining the world just like it is right now, except with one difference where it rained yesterday, and then what you're doing is you're making conclusions. Oh, well, if it had rained yesterday, that great picnic we had would have been ruined, right? We wouldn't have been able to have that great picnic. That would have been awful. And that's really what it amounts to when you're thinking about counterfactuals. So let's practice our newfound counterfactual skills. So I'm going to throw some sentences out at you. This is a test. Who thinks that I could have stayed in bed with a headache today? Nice. Still holding up. Who thinks that I might have been a ballerina? Thank you. I appreciate your level of confidence. I got fewer people who put up their hands. I could have been a ballerina, damn it. Who thinks that 1 + 1 might equal 3? Oh, come on. You can't go for that one. Seriously? No. So that's definitely false. And 8 is now going for it. Okay. So that's a mathematical or logical truth. And so traditionally that's seen as necessarily false, right? It's not true. It is true in all possible worlds that 1 + 1 = 2. And then finally, who thinks that the criminals might not have murdered the innocent family? Good. Nice. All right. The illusion has been broken, at least for some of you. Okay. So in my experience, children, I'm not doing this to be mean, I'm just pointing this out, that children often have difficulties thinking about counterfactuals. I run into this, not my children are really mature now. They don't run into it. But when they were little, they ran into some issues with this. But if, for example, let's say that there's a glass of milk on the edge of a table, and I might say, hey, move that glass of milk back, or it might fall and spill and make a mess. And then invariably, child would say, well, it didn't. And that would be a convincing argument. Well, it didn't actually fall off. So, what am I worried about? And I often have difficulty explaining, yeah, but there's a could have, it might have, having it on the edge of the table. And then the argument is, but it didn't. But that's missing the point, right? It's all about alternative possibilities. Of course, what actually happened is not the point here. The milk could fall, and being aware of the possibility, regardless of what actually happened, is important, right? That's the point. There's a whole logic of counterfactuals called modal logic. It's something you can study. I actually studied that in graduate school. There's a whole branch of logic having to do with necessity and possibility. And you can do really interesting things with modal logic. You could do all sorts of proofs for the existence of God. It's fun to translate them into modal logic and see what you get. But there is a whole logic for the way that we think about things that are different than the way that things actually are. In modal logic, the formal definition of necessity is what is true in every possible world. If the only world that you consider, like Sam Harris, is the actual world, then everything is necessary by definition, in a very trivial sense, right? If you restrict your scope to the actual world, then everything is necessary, because that's what necessity is. It's truth across all possible worlds. All right, so I'm going to go a little farther with this, because there is something called a whole causal theory of explanation. This is Princeton philosopher David Lewis, who I admire quite a bit. He's focused most of his career on modal logic, and he used modal logic to analyze two things that I think are important to this discussion: the notion of causation, the notion of explanation. So from David Lewis's perspective, the difference between constant correlation and causation are counterfactuals, right? That there is a traditional problem in philosophy coming from David Hume about what's the difference between just two events following one another and an actual causal relationship between the two events where one event causes the other. Statisticians, data scientists worry about that all the time, confusing correlation with causation. The answer, according to David Lewis, is one thing causes another, if but not A, then not B, right? So by thinking about counterfactuals, that brings in the necessary conceptual apparatus to be able to make sense of causation. You have to think about other possible worlds to be able to explain that there's more than just a correlation between two events. Now, the reason I'm bringing this up is this leads to something called the causal theory of explanation, which David Lewis pushes, which I find a very intuitive account of explanation. The idea there is you explain something by giving the causes that lead up to the event. So the reason I'm explaining all of this is the reason that we care whether or not the criminals could have untied the children is that's important for an explanation of the murder, right? If the criminals murdered the children because they could have released them, if releasing the children wasn't even a possibility, we wouldn't have blamed the criminals for, killing the children. But from our perspective, it not only was a possibility, it's something that they should have done, right? They should have untied the children in that case. So they could have untied the children, and they should have untied the children, and so what they did was wrong. So even though they didn't actually do it, but that's not the point. We care about what they could have done. So let's return to the horrendous crime. Again, what actually happened is that the two criminals killed the two girls tied to the bed by lighting the house on fire. Comingers, he said, quote, "It just didn't cross my mind to untie the two children." I believe him. I really do. It's horrible, but I believe him. I think he just didn't care. The life or death of the people in the house just wasn't an important consideration for him. So actually, wasn't even something that could have, he just, in the actual world, he didn't think of the children at all, and so the children died. That's a horrible thing. If I was in that situation, I would have untied the children before burning down the house. I mean, hopefully I wouldn't burn down the house, but let's not even investigate that part right there. But we judge people on what they could have done, what they should do, and not what they actually did, right? What they actually did is beside the point. So let's talk about the ethical implications of this, of free will versus compatibilism. According to Sam Harris, remember, the shocking truth that there's no free will has made him a better person. Because by increasing his feelings of compassion and forgiveness and diminishing his sense of entitlement in the fruits of his good luck. That's what the lack of free will has taught him. But I want to say here, I think nurturing a sense of compassion is a good thing. I think it's important. I'm all for people nursing a sense of compassion. But I just don't think that should be the go-to emotion in the case of this horrific crime. The first thing you should feel when you hear about this horrible murder isn't compassion for the murderers. While it is true in a metaphysical sense that I could have been one of those criminals, that's a really, really remote possibility, right? Because I share so little of my psychology with those criminals that they are hopefully in a very distant possible world from where I am. They're not close to my actual world at all. And so for me, that's not the appropriate emotion to feel. There are a lot of other emotions that you can feel in that situation. Anger, regret, injustice. And I think that feeling an emotion such as moral anger makes much more sense in the face of a horrific crime than immediately going to compassion. So Jared Diamond, are you guys familiar with Jared Diamond? He wrote Guns, Germs, and Stills, great author. He's wrote Collapse, I think was his other book. But he wrote an article for The New Yorker. I'll post it on the Facebook site because it's actually free on the web. You can read it. And it's a really interesting article. So let me briefly summarize it. So in the article, he talks about two murders. So Jared Diamond spent a lot of time in New Guinea, living with traditional people in New Guinea. And the first part of the article, he talks about his driver. One of the times he went to New Guinea, his driver had recently murdered someone. And so Jared Diamond was asking him about that. And he explained that in New Guinea culture, his uncle was murdered by someone in another tribe. And then he spent 3 years and lots of money and organizing people to get revenge for the murder. It was a huge undertaking. And it was one of the things that consumed most of his money, most of his effort, most of his time, until he finally got to the point where he got revenge for the person for his uncle was killed. So he got revenge for the person who killed his uncle. And he was expressing pride and satisfaction that he finally had avenged that murder. Now, I'm definitely not advising that we should go back to revenge killings, but one thing that Jared Diamond talks about is that's extremely common up till, what he says, like 500 years ago. It's still very common in some countries, yeah. So, and even gangs in the United States, that you have that culture of that endless cycle of revenge killing. So it's not anything that anyone's advocating that we go back to a bunch of tribes fighting one another and getting into revenge cycles. But the point I'm making here is that the natural reaction to someone in your family getting murdered was revenge. And then Jared Diamond is pointing out that that's a very human reaction to that situation. And he contrasts that story with another semi-shocking story. He contrasts it with his father-in-law was a Holocaust survivor, and his father-in-law's family, actually, all of them were killed in the Holocaust by a German officer. And his father-in-law found himself in a situation where he found the person who killed all of his family, and he had them at gunpoint. And he had that at gunpoint, and he had to decide whether he was going to pull the trigger or not. And he thought about it. Everyone was actually encouraging him to pull the trigger and kill the person who killed his family, but he decided not to do it. He decided that he would give the person over to the legal system. And what happened in that case is he was released within a year, and his father-in-law spent the remaining 60 years of his life every day in agony and regret and guilt that he didn't do anything to avenge the death of his family. His family was killed by this guy. And there was no justice there. There was nothing to be done to actually make up for the fact that the person, had killed his whole family. So it had horrible consequences for this person for the rest of his life. So I believe, like David Hume, that any moral theory, including things like consequentialism and utilitarianism, must ultimately be grounded in our moral emotions. A person who always focuses on compassion, excluding every other moral emotion, has a lopsided morality. Regret, guilt, shame, justice are also important to our human psychology and also important to the way that we think about morality. So again, my point here is not to say that we shouldn't feel any compassion at all for the criminals. It just shouldn't be your go-to emotion when hearing that, horrific story of what happened. So let me get to my conclusion. I want to make sure that the Sam Harris spell has been completely broken. So I'm going to ask that you repeat after me. Here we go. It could have rained yesterday.
It could have rained yesterday.
The criminals did not have to murder the children.
The criminals did not have to murder the children.
You can imagine a better world than this one, and you can change. Sparkly heads. Better world than this one.
Better world than this one.
And you can change. Yeah, close enough. Good enough. All right. So let's stop here and discuss.